Hey guys, it's Chandler with Utah Trikes, back with another tech video. Today we're going to talk about the Cat 4 quad conversion, also the Fat Cat quad conversion. We're going to go over all the different parts that you're going to need for this conversion. We're going to go over all the different assemblies so you understand how they work. We're also going to talk about why you might want to convert your trike to a quad. If you followed us for a while, you've probably seen some of the crazy builds that we've done, or you might know of our Revolution E-Quad. But what do you do if you already have a trike? Well, that's where we came up with the Cat 4 quad conversion, so you can make your existing trike into a quad. Or you can buy one outright built into a quad. Some of the reasons we might want to have a quad over a trike, there's a number of reasons. Adding an extra wheel will give you a little more stability, it'll give you a little more traction, and then if you're an off-road guy, off-roading capabilities with the extra two wheels, two-wheel drive, it's going to be a really nice machine. So some of the parts you're going to need to do this quad conversion. You're going to need a rear hub. If your trike is a stock Catrike and doesn't have the brake mount flange, you're going to need to get a hub that has a brake mount flange for the secondary chain. We like to use the Shimano Dior. And then you're going to need the quad couplers. These are a lot like our extension plates when adding a larger wheel to your Catrike. These will allow you to bolt on the rear end assembly. And then of course, you're gonna need the rear end assembly. We have two different size rear ends because Catrike has the Catrike Max, which is a little bit wider than the standard Catrike. So make sure you specify which rear end you need for the model of trike you're gonna do. For demonstration purposes, we're gonna show you how to assemble this. So let's get into that. So first thing, we're gonna go over the assembly of the diff. So you have your 17 mil freewheel adapters, the differential housing, two freewheels, a 22 tooth sprocket, and then the hardware to assemble the diff housing. So first we're going to take the freewheels and the freewheel adapters and thread them in. And just thread them in as you can, tight with your hand. And now there's a left and a right, kind of hard to see on camera, but one has a little ridge here. That's going to be the one that's going to stick out on the left side, so that'll ride against the bearing. And then you have the smooth side. This one's going to be inside of the diff, something like that. So you'll take the one that's smooth for the right side, and this will go in the bottom of the housing. And then the left side with the groove, with the little ridge, is going to go on the top. And then this half of the housing will go together like that. And you want to make sure you line up the holes on both of the bodies. And then this whole assembly is going to be pressed together. Then you take your sprocket and you put the 4 bolts through. And then these are going to line up with the 4 holes in the housing. And then when it's all pressed together, you'll have a nut and a washer for each bolt. Since this has to be pressed, I've got one already built. So you can see how it's fully assembled here. Pressed together with a bolt and a nut and a washer through it. Now hold it all together. Now you have 2 individual free wheels allowing the left or right wheel to slip while you're riding. But as you pedal, it'll be twisting the differential that way. It'll spin both because of the free wheel. So that's the diff assembled. Now that we have the differential assembled, we're going to go ahead and assemble the rear end assembly. The parts that you have the housing, the assembled differential, your left and right brake mount hubs, 4 bearings, 1 lock collar, a left and right axle, 2 axle caps, and 2 axle bolts. The first step for assembling the diff, we're going to install the bearings. There's 2 bearings on the inside, 2 bearings on the outside. They're not a press fit, just a snug fit. Now we're going to start with a short axle. This is going to be your left side axle. You'll see that there's 2 keyways. There's a keyway that goes all the way out the end, and then another keyway here closer to the other side. This is going to be the side that goes in the diff. So you want to make sure you put it outside in so that this side will line up with the diff. Line it up with the bearings and slide it through. And just put a good hand on the bearing to make sure that bearing doesn't pop out. Then take your key and put it on the end of the axle. Then take your differential. Like we mentioned before, there's a left and a right. So the side that has the freewheel adapter sticking out is going to be the left side. Line up the keyway on the freewheel adapter with the key on the axle. And before we set any of the set screws, we want to measure this end distance. We're going to just temporarily put the brake mount adapter on, and we're going to measure this distance. You're going to want this distance to be 70 millimeters or less, because if this axle's sticking too far out, the axle cap is going to tighten against the axle and not against the wheel, and then your wheel's not going to be tight. So grab your handy tape measure, and then make sure we're at 70 mils. Keep your tape measure handy so we can double check it. So now we're going to lock down the set screw in the freewheel adapter. There's two set screws. It's hard to see on camera, but there's a pointy one and a flat one. You're going to want to use the flat one on the key and the pointy one on the axle. So we're going to start with the key side. Take a little bit of Loctite. We like to use just a little bit of blue Loctite. We want it to come apart if we need to, but we don't want it to come loose on its own. So we're going to put just a little dab on the key, on the set screw. Now you can turn the axle a little bit to access that set screw. We're just going to snug it up and then double check our measurement here. Make sure this hasn't moved. Right on 70. Then we're going to take the other set screw. 180 degrees from that first set screw, you'll see the other threaded hole in the freewheel adapter. A little bit more Loctite on this one. Snug it up, and then let's double check that measurement one more time. Still at 70, and go ahead and snug up the other one. Now we're going to repeat the process on the other side. Now we're going to install the other axle. Same as the first one, make sure that you're putting this side that has the keyway going all the way through the axle into the diff. Before you put it into the diff, we need to put this little lock collar on. This is going to hold this bearing from falling out. As you can see, just like the freewheel adapter, there's a little ridge here that's going to be pressing against that bearing. So make sure that this is going towards the bearing. Then line it up with the diff. Don't forget your key. Slide that axle in. Now we're going to put this brake mount on so we can check our measurement. Okay. Now we're going to tighten up the set screws. So you can see here the differential body has a hole, so that way you can access the freewheel that's inside, and that's where the set screws are going to be. So same as the other side, put a little thread locker on, and then we're going to tighten down these set screws. So now that we got the axles and the diff locked and we got our dimensions here on the rear set up, we're going to tighten down this lock collar. So you'll take the bolt the collar comes with, put a little thread locker on that as well. Thread that in, and then make sure this is fully seated against that bearing. Make sure it's good and snug. Okay. Now we're going to put on the free wheel or the rear wheel adapters. So this here will have, the wheel will have 6 bolts where the rotor usually goes, and it'll key into this hub. But if you want to opt for rear brakes, your rotor will go here on the inside and bolt to these holes here. And you also have a caliper mount here on the body of the rear end. So we're going to go ahead and put our key in and then line up the keyway, slide that all the way on, and make sure you can see that key through the hole where the set screw goes. And then same thing as the diff, we're going to put a little thread locker on this set screw. And tighten down this brake adapter. And make sure you hold it there good and tight against that bearing, because this will also retain the bearings in the rear end. And now we have a fully assembled rear end for the Cat 4. Now that we got the rear end assembly ready to go on, now we got to get our trike ready for the quad conversion. First thing we're going to do is remove this chain. Now we have the chain off, we're going to remove the derailleur, the rear wheel, and the derailleur hanger. And the last thing we need to remove is the fender if your trike has a fender. So now that we got everything taken off of the trike, we're going to install the quad couplers. So we have a couple different models that use different style quad couplers, so make sure you specify which model you need. This one has the dropout or the through axle, so we're going to use the dropout conversion style plate. So if you have this kind of trike, we do have a video. We'll link that in the description as well. Go ahead and snug up all the bolts. Once you have your quad couplers on, the next step is installing the new rear hub that we're going to put on. So if you're going with the 10-speed and you're using the Dior, you're going to need to swap your cassette from your wheel to the new hub. So now we're going to take this cassette off of the original wheel and reinstall it on the new hub. So taking the cassette off is pretty simple. You just need a couple tools. You'll need a cassette tool for your specific cassette. There's a bunch of different types, so just make sure you know which one you need. Drop the cassette tool in, and then also some kind of chain whip or chain pliers. This will hold the cassette, because if you try to loosen it, that freewheel is just going to spin, so you need something to hold the cassette. So this little fancy tool, then you can hold the cassette, and you just take a crescent wrench. And once you got it loose, then you can just spin that off. And then you want to carefully take this off so you don't lose the order of the gears. But if you do, it's pretty easy. It goes big all the way to small. And then you just got to pay attention that there is some spacers here on the cassette. Make sure if you just keep it together, then you won't lose where you're at. Now we'll take our new hub. It can be kind of tricky to get it all lined up at once. So I'm just going to do it piece by piece. There's only one way that the gears go on. So you just kind of turn it until they drop in place. Spacer. Gear. Spacer. you go. And you take your lock ring, get it started. And now since it has a free wheel, you don't have to hold the chain, you just grab the hub and tighten it down. Now the last thing we need to do for this hub is we need to install the secondary sprocket. And this is just a 6-hole sprocket that will line up with the 6 holes on the hub. And then we're going to install 6 5x20 button head bolts with a little bit of thread locker on each one. So a little dab of thread locker. And you want to tighten the sprocket down the same that you do a rotor in a crisscross pattern so that you don't warp the sprocket. So just put them in just snug. We don't want to tighten them all down until we have all of them snugged up. Now we can go ahead and tighten them all down in a star pattern. And there's our assembled new rear hub. Now that we got our new hub assembled, we're going to install it into the trike. This model had a through axle rear wheel, but with the new dropout quad conversion plates, we're going to be using a skewer style hub instead. You just line it up in the new dropouts, install the axle. Make sure the hub is all the way seated in the dropouts. You want to make sure this axle is good and tight. Now that we have our hub in, next step is installing the rear end assembly. So now we're going to install the rear end assembly. When you look at the housing, you'll see that there is a smaller bent tube down here, and this one's a lot bigger on top. This is the top and this is the bottom. So when you install it on your trike, make sure the bigger tube is on the top. And you just slide it into the rear quad couplers. It'll just slide right in. And then we're going to install 6 8x20 socket head bolts, and we're going to put a little thread locker on each one. We're going to put a little thread locker on each bolt and just loosely thread them in for now. We don't want to tighten these bolts all the way up yet because we need to be able to slide this rear end forward and back to tension the secondary chain. Now that we got the rear end in place and the bolts all just hand tight, we're going to add the secondary chain. So make sure the rear end is pushed as far forward as it'll go in the quad couplers. Then we're going to install the chain. We're just using a standard 8-speed chain. So we're going to route the chain over the sprocket on the differential and then the secondary sprocket on the hub. And then we want to size the chain as close as we can, but making sure that we leave a little bit of slack. And we'll break the chain to the right length. Now that we got the chain sized, we're going to reinstall it and connect the chain with a master link. If you're not sure how to break a chain or size a chain, we do have a chain sizing video. It's all the same process for most chains. So go ahead and check out that video. We'll link that in the description. Now we got the chain installed. You can see there's quite a bit of slack. That's because we haven't tensioned it yet. So now that we have the chain in place, you can slide the rear end backwards until the chain is tight. So go ahead and pull back on the chain side and tighten one of these down to lock it in place. And then double check the chain is tight, give it a good spin, make sure that it's not too tight. And now we have one bolt tightened here to lock the chain in place. We just want to look at the rear end and kind of eyeball the gap here. And we just want it to get even so that the rear end is square. We don't want it this side too far back. So kind of just look it over and get as close as you can. Once you have it in, lock the other side down. And then spin that chain again just to make sure it's still tight and not too tight. And now go ahead and tighten up the rest of the bolts. Now that we have the rear end all installed, now we're going to reinstall the derailleur. The dropout plate we'll show you on the other side has a mount for the derailleur. It already has a derailleur hanger built in. So we're going to mount that next and then redo all the gearing. Now we're going to reinstall the derailleur. Like I mentioned before, this side has the derailleur hanger built into the quad coupler, so you won't be using the original one anymore. So let's install that. Now that we have the derailleur reinstalled, now you can reset up your shifting cable and then reinstall your chain. Now that we got the derailleur all set up, we're going to reinstall the chain. But when you're using these quad couplers, it's actually moving your rear hub backwards a little bit, so you might need to add some more chain and resize your chain. It'll just be a case by case, so when you put it back together, just pay attention to the chain length when you're putting it all back together. Now that we got the whole rear end all installed and all the gearing put back in place, the next step is adding the rear wheels. If you're just going for a Cat 4 conversion, say on the Max Trike, it's going to come with OEM front wheels that match the trike that you're using. So this one, we would put Max front wheels on it. But from here on, we're going to be moving on to the Fat Cat conversion. So we're going to be installing some 26x4 fat wheels. So on the Cat 4, like we mentioned before, you have this wheel brake mount hub that has little slots for the bolts to line up. So we're going to take our wheel here on the rotor mounting surface. We're going to install 6 5mm socket head bolts with some thread locker. That way this hub will key into the rear brake mount adapter, and that's what keys the wheel to the axle so it spins when you pedal. So let's go ahead and do that. So on the Revolution wheel, it has this little cap. This is for the front spindle of a Catrike, but we don't need this for the rear of the Cat 4. So you'll just pop this little thing out. And now we're just going to put a little thread locker on all the threads here. Just a little bit, not too much. We don't want these coming loose. We're just going to thread them in. And since there's no rotor or sprocket going on here, it doesn't matter how you tighten them down. There we go. Now we're ready to install the rear wheel. So now we're going to install the rear wheels. So you simply just line it up with the axle, slide it on, and then line up the bolts on that hub. And then take your axle cap and your axle bolt. We're going to put a little thread locker on the bolt. Place the axle cap in the wheel. Make sure it slides over that axle. And some thread locker on the bolt. Go ahead and thread that axle bolt in. And as long as you got the length of your axle set right, this axle bolt will tighten against the axle cap, and the cap will tighten against the bearings in the wheel. You want to get this good and tight. And then give it a feel. Make sure there's no play in the wheel. That's how we know we got it set perfectly. So let's go ahead and do the other side. Now that we got the rear wheels on, we're pretty much done with the rear end. So let's move over to the front. Now moving on to the front, obviously we got to change these wheels to the fat front wheels. But while we're at it, we have some things that we like to consider. Catrike comes with the vertical handlebars, but once you start putting bigger tires on the front, these handlebars get a little bit harder to control the trike with the extra weight and the bigger size tire. It's hard when you don't have as much leverage over the wheels. So we're going to go over the horizontal conversion handlebars, which essentially will change from a vertical bar like this to a horizontal bar that goes over the tire. And it also gives you a little more room for your hands so you're not so close to the big fat tire. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to start with removing all the unnecessary parts. We're going to start with the wheels, then we're going to remove the brakes and the handlebars, and on this trike, the easy entry aids. Let's go ahead and remove the axle. We're going to reuse the axle, but we're not going to use the wheels. And I like to just keep the axle in the spindle just so I don't lose any of the pieces. Now let's go ahead and remove the handlebars. Since we're moving the handlebars up to be higher over the wheel, we're going to have to replace all of our brake cables and our shifting cables. So let's go ahead and do that next. So this is our new horizontal bar that we're going to install. This comes in the horizontal conversion kit. So you're just going to mount this on the handlebar. And you can mount this bar anywhere you want on this lower handlebar, whatever suits your needs or your size. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the same on the other side. Now that we have the horizontal conversion bars in place, we're going to take the original vertical handlebar and we're going to put it on top to be the new handlebar. But obviously you can see nothing is oriented as it should be as a horizontal bar. So we're going to mount the bar and then we're going to reorient the brakes and the shifter to make everything in a proper place for when it's all installed. And for this video, I'm just going to show you the way that we do it here at Utah Trikes, but you're welcome to orient it however you want, whatever's comfortable and fits you. With the bar and shifters, I like to use this little armrest post. I like to put that up here in the top. This makes it a little easier for you to reach, so it's close to the handlebar. Over here on the side, it's just kind of awkward to shift, so I like to put it up here on top. So since we changed the orientation of the handlebar, you'll notice that the brake lever for the right just isn't going to fit where we want it to go. So we're just going to take the brake lever from the left handlebar and put it on the right, and then take the right and put it on the left. There we go. That's a much better fit. Just going to snug it up temporarily. Now we'll reinstall the grip. Use a little bit of alcohol. It helps to lube it on so it'll go in place. And we're going to butt the brake lever up against that grip so everything looks nice and clean. Now we'll continue on to the other side. Now we got the handlebars all oriented how we want them. We're going to run new shifter cables and new brake cables because the handlebars are a lot longer and higher up. So let's go ahead and do that next. All right, we're going to start with the brake cable. What I like to do is just kind of dry fit it, hold it in place, and kind of just run it the way we want to run it to kind of figure out how big we need it. And just kind of eyeball. Cut it a little long, that way you can trim it if you need to, but you don't want to cut it too short. So when you're routing these cables, you want to make sure that there's no hard bends. So you want to have a nice smooth bend so that the cable doesn't kink or get jammed while we're using it. And we're just going to kind of eyeball it again, see where we're at. Trim it a little bit more. Now that we got our cable length set, let's grab some new brake cables. So get your cable installed into your brake lever, and then take your new housing. Make sure you put a ferrule on the end, and then we're going to run this cable through the housing. And then run this cable through the caliper. And then secure it to the caliper. While I'm working on this handlebar, I'm going to go ahead and do the shifter as well. So first we're going to remove the old housing because it's too short. So the same as the brake housing, we're going to run the shifter housing back to the derailleur and work our way forward up to the handle to see how long we need it to be. We're just going to cut it a little long to make sure. See how we did. Okay, perfect. So now we're going to take our new shift cable, install it in the shifter. Make sure it's fully seated in the shifter. And then add the ferrule. And then secure it to your derailleur. So now that we got all the housing and cables installed, we're going to go ahead and tie up all the slack and secure it tightly to the handlebar. We just like to use a couple cable ties. Quick and easy, and they look nice. Like I said before, make sure you don't have any sharp bends. We don't want that shift cable or brake cable kinking inside of the housing. Once you have all your zip ties on and everything's tight, we're going to go ahead and trim the ties off. So we're going to install the brake housing. We're just kind of do like a rough lineup, holding it as we go. We want to make sure that there's no sharp bends in the housing. We don't want the cable getting jammed. Let's see here, we'll trim this one down a little bit. Make sure you cut it long until you know exactly where it needs to go. And put it back in and just double check. Yeah, that looks good. So now let's take our new cable, install it into the brake lever. And take your housing, install a ferrule, and then put the cable through the housing. And then install the cable into the caliper. So these new 26x4 wheels use the same hub as Catrike, so they'll just mount up the same as the original wheel. But we need to take our brake rotors off the original wheel and put on the new wheels. So let's go do that. So we're just going to simply take this rotor off, same as any other one. Loosen all the bolts up. Now that we got the rotor off, we can put it on the new wheel. What you want to pay attention to is the direction of the tire in relation to the direction of the rotor. So on the tire, most of the time we'll have a little arrow, but if it doesn't have an arrow, you can kind of see the direction that the tread is going. You just want to match the rotor as well. The rotor will have a little arrow that will tell you the direction of it, but you can see also this has like an obvious direction that the rotor is. So you just want to match the rotor to the tire. And since we removed the rotor bolts, we want to go ahead and put some more thread locker into the new wheel to make sure these rotor bolts don't come loose. And we want to make sure that we tighten down the rotor bolts in a star pattern so that we don't warp the rotor. And don't tighten any of them down until you have all of them started. That way all the bolt holes line up. Now we have all the rotor bolts started. Let's go ahead and tighten them down. Make sure to tighten them down in a star pattern. Let's go back through one more time, make sure they're all tight. Now we're ready to install the wheel on the trike. Now that we got our brake rotor installed, let's go ahead and install the wheel on the trike. Just like a stock Catrike, pull the axle back, line your rotor up with the caliper, slide the axle in, make sure this wheel is good and tight. There we go. Once you get the wheels installed, the next step is just to go through your brakes and your shifting, adjust the brakes and shifting as needed. Since we replaced the cables, you will need to readjust all your brakes. But otherwise, that's pretty much it for the Cat 4 install. Now that you have your trike all reassembled, like I said before, now is a good time to go over your brakes and your shifting, make sure everything is still good to go. Since we replaced the cables, you might need to readjust some things. Another big thing I recommend, double check your toe alignment. Now that you have bigger wheels, if there's any misalignment with your front toe alignment, it's going to be amplified with the bigger wheels, and you're really going to notice it. So double check your alignment, double check your brakes and your shifting. But other than that, you're pretty much ready to roll. While you're in the market for a Cat 4, we do have some accessories that are specific for the Cat 4. We have this cool clamp-on rear hitch that mounts just right to the rear end. So it's just a basic DIY hitch that you can modify to fit your needs. We also have a flat transport rack that bolts on top of the rear end. So if you need some extra cargo space, definitely check out that rack. All right, guys, that pretty much covers the Cat 4 conversion and the Fat Cat conversion. If you have any other questions about the install or you're not sure what parts you need to order, definitely give us a call or email. Our salesman will be happy to help. Hopefully this video was helpful, but if you do have questions as you're going, definitely give us a call. We'd love to help you out. Anyways, guys, relax, spin fast, ride trikes.